The restaurant stood at the corner of Tremont and 16th, the kind of place where a single meal cost more than it was worth, and waiters vanished the instant a plate touched the tablecloth. I had researched it carefully before confirming the reservation, not because I was nervous about a first date, but because I had long since learned that the choice of venue revealed more about a person's intentions than their words ever could. A public place, safe, easy to exit if needed, and bright enough that no one could claim they didn't see the other clearly. Thomas Russo's profile suggested a man who understood those calculations well. I arrived at 7:47, 13 minutes early, a habit formed in the years I worked as a restaurant server, where punctuality was the line dividing professionals from amateurs. The hostess greeted me with a kind of warmth that had been rehearsed to perfection, the sort of smile that felt like it had been part of a script written decades ago. My name was already marked in the system, table 12, by the window. I was led there immediately, and chose the seat with my back against the wall, another habit I'd never bothered to break. It had begun raining on my drive over, not the gentle kind that inspired autumn stories, but the kind that fell hard enough to blur the world into haze. Raindrops slid down the window pane, stretching the city lights into wet oil-painted streaks. In our messages, I had once told Thomas that I loved rainy nights. There was something about the weather that forced people to be honest, to stop pretending they had anywhere else to be. He had only replied with a single heart emoji. The brevity of it left me wondering whether it was confidence or just laziness. My phone buzzed. A message from my editor. A source had confirmed that Councilman Brown's wife had just hired an attorney. Something was shifting. I set the phone down without responding. Work could wait a few hours. Investigation was my passion, but it wasn't supposed to be my entire life. That was what my therapist had reminded me in our last session, with a gentleness that made me suspect she'd repeated the same line hundreds of times to other women like me. At 8:04, the hostess returned, a man walking behind her. I recognized the face first: dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of symmetry that looked designed by an architect rather than born of chance. The profile picture was accurate, but everything else was wrong. The way he moved through the restaurant gave the impression of someone who owned the place rather than visited it. There was no trace of caution in his stride, none of the awkwardness of a man arriving for a first meeting. This was someone used to being watched and utterly unbothered by it. He sat down before the hostess could even finish her introduction, pulling out the chair without confirming I was the person he was meeting. Up close, I saw a small scar tracing from the corner of his left eye down his cheek, a scar that spoke of old violence, not a recent accident. "You're Elaine," he said, not as a question but as a certainty. His voice carried an Italian undertone, not the performative accent Americans often imitate, but something raw, native, rising from the throat as if he'd never considered concealing it. "I'm Vincent. Thomas is my brother." The waiter appeared instantly, as if summoned from some invisible distance. Vincent ordered a whiskey without asking my preference, without glancing at the drink menu. Straight. The efficiency of it felt like a message, though I couldn't yet decipher what it meant. "Your brother never mentioned having a twin," I said. "Thomas only mentions what benefits him." He slid his phone across the table. My own face stared back at me from the screen, a photo from an article I'd written 6 weeks earlier about government corruption and suspected ties to organized crime. It had been taken outside the courthouse where I'd waited for a source who never showed up. "From your investigation on Councilman Brown," he said. "You mentioned a Mafia network, but there was no concrete proof, just speculation and a few irregular financial transfers." I froze completely. I knew the precise moment when an ordinary situation crossed into danger, and this was it. "How do you know I'm investigating that?" I asked. "Because I've been following your work for the past 3 months. He drank half his whiskey and set the glass down with mechanical precision. "Everything you publish is verified from multiple sources before it goes live. You never defame anyone, you build cases, which means you've already traced the Marzano Syndicate's expansion in this area, you just don't have the final link to make it unshakable." The restaurant seemed to shift its rhythm around us. Conversations continued. Couples still leaned toward one another in candlelight, but within the small space between Vincent and me, something had begun, something I was only just starting to grasp the size of. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because my brother finds you intriguing," he said, "and I find you valuable." He leaned back in his chair, posture relaxed but eyes drilling through whatever composure I had left. "Women like you, journalists with real ethics, are rare. You don't stop when the road gets rough. You pull the thread until the curtain falls apart. I want to see what happens when someone like you gets access to the truth, not the sanitized version filtered through official channels. And why would you give me that access? I asked quietly. Because the Marzano organization is becoming a problem I intend to solve, and your investigation might speed things up. He finished his drink. We both want the same thing. We just haven't admitted it yet. If you've listened this far, you can probably feel the city breathing in the rain, the kind of place where random encounters hide deliberate calculations. Elaine's story is only beginning, and behind the door Vincent Russo just opened, there are secrets no one has dared to name. Before we step deeper into that world, subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can keep spreading tales where darkness collides with light. And you, where are you listening from? Leave the name of your city or country below, so we'll know this journey has reached your heart, wherever in the world you may be. I left the restaurant around 9:30. The rain hadn't stopped. Cold drops clung to my coat as I stood by the curb, trying to process what had just happened. Vincent Russo wasn't the man I'd agreed to meet, but he clearly knew too much about me for this to be coincidence. He had chosen this night, this restaurant, that table, and even the exact moment I would be approached. Nothing about it had been random. I didn't go home immediately. I drove aimlessly through streets whose names I'd known for more than a decade working for the Boston Chronicle, the same streets that had appeared in my investigations, where I'd interviewed victims, chased corruption cases, and exposed the gray layers of a city everyone insisted was beautiful. When I took on my first story about suspicious redevelopment money in the South End, I hadn't expected to pull a thread that would lead to the Mafia. I simply wanted to know why an entire low-income neighborhood had been bought up by faceless real estate companies, using cash, properties changing hands every 6 months. What I discovered was a network of shell corporations, each name sounding as though plucked from an old Italian phone book. The buildings were renovated superficially, reappraised at triple their original value, and then sold to foreign investment funds. From there, the origin of the money became as blurry as footprints erased in snow. I wrote 3 articles, then 5. Each one triggered phone calls to the editorial board, threats of lawsuits, withdrawn advertisements. But I kept going, not because I saw myself as a hero or craved recognition, but because I'd seen people lose their homes to financial games they never even knew they were playing. My mother had been one of them. A mortgage sold 3 times, a penalty clause printed so small she couldn't read it, and then one winter morning, men came to the door, giving her 48 hours to leave. She cried not for the house, but because she couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. I've never forgotten the feeling of standing beside her at 18, helpless, holding her old suitcase while strangers unscrewed the window frame where she used to hang Christmas curtains. Since then, I made myself a promise. If I could, I would always be the one to ask, why, and never stop until I had an answer. This work was never a choice, it was a reflex. Like flinching when someone touches an old wound you don't think, you just react. That's why I never quit, even when it felt like I was running through a maze with no exit. And now, a man like Vincent, born from the very shadows I'd been trying to expose, was handing me a map. The question was whether that map would lead me toward the light or pull me deeper into the dark. Vincent knew I wasn't the kind of woman who turned down a story just because it was dangerous. He was using that knowledge like a hook, leaving me suspended between professional ethics and the hunger to uncover the final truth. I reached my apartment at 10:30. The place was quiet, as if the world had paused. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd been compiling on the South End companies. The name Vincent Russo didn't appear anywhere. Not directly, no signature, no ownership record. But one thing was clear. Men like him didn't leave traces unless they wanted to. I stared at the screen and wondered, if this was a door, did I have the clarity to step through it without losing myself? Or would I, like my mother once did, sign a contract only to realize too late that it was a trap? The difference was, I knew it was a trap and still felt drawn to what lay inside. Investigation isn't about finding safety. It's about reaching for what others want to keep hidden, and sometimes confronting the reason you began in the first place. And perhaps Vincent Russo had just reminded me of that reason. The next morning, an envelope was wedged beneath my apartment door. There was no return name, only a single sheet of paper printed in classic Times New Roman, the kind chosen by someone who never tries to impress but always commands attention. On it, there was just one line. If you're still curious, meet me at noon at Café La Rue, last table by the window. No signature, but I knew it was Vincent. Café La Rue sat on Charles Street, at the edge of Beacon Hill, where every brick on the sidewalk carried the weight of something old, preserved to the point of unease. I arrived 10 minutes early, old habits die hard, and ordered a black coffee, no sugar. The cafe was nearly empty. The only people lingering were old men reading paper newspapers and a young waitress who set down napkins as if it were the final gesture before retreating. Vincent arrived at exactly noon, not a minute late, not a wasted greeting. He sat down across from me, placing a thick envelope and a silver lighter on the table. I noticed it immediately. The lighter was engraved with the initials L.R., not his, perhaps a keepsake, or a reminder of something he refused to forget. He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Inside, he said, his voice low and even, is a copy of the acquisition contract for a chain of convenience stores in Dorchester. The purchasing company is called Elmstone Holdings. Sounds legitimate, but it's a shell. Check the books and you'll see 3 months after the buyout, cash transactions quadrupled, yet the tax report stayed the same. I lifted the envelope. Heavy, substantial, the kind of material that would take me weeks to uncover on my own. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, my eyes never leaving it. "Because you're smart enough to know what it means," he said, "and honest enough to verify it before you write. If—" I leaned back in my chair, silent for several seconds. It felt like stepping into a chess game, where the board had long been arranged, and he was simply handing me the first pawn. And even knowing that, I couldn't look away. "If I write this story," I asked slowly, "what do you get out of it?" Vincent smiled, not the kind that invites warmth, but the weary curve of someone who's seen too much foolishness to pretend anymore. "I don't want profit, I want results. Marzano is moving into territory I've controlled for 20 years. I could handle it the old way, but I'm trying something different. You are that something." The answer silenced me. There was something in his tone that wasn't manipulation or threat, it was resignation, as if he already knew I wouldn't stop, whether or not I had a choice, and he was merely offering a path that looked cleaner than the others. When he stood to leave, I asked without looking up, "What if I hadn't shown up?" Vincent paused for half a heartbeat, just long enough for me to feel the answer before hearing it. "Then someone else would have received that file, but I don't trust anyone else." He left without turning back. I remained, staring at the cooled coffee and the envelope that, once opened, would erase any chance of retreat. In investigative work, there are moments you know everything is shifting, not through loud revelations or grand declarations, but through the silence that follows a choice you can never take back. I opened the envelope at 3 that afternoon. Inside were contracts, bank ledgers, photographs of cash transactions, and a single handwritten note in black ink, unsigned, that read, "Every dollar has a history. The question is, who tells the right story?" I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but because I'd found the story I'd been quietly waiting for, and for the first time in years, my heart was racing not from anxiety, but from something I'd almost forgotten, an aching, unstoppable hunger to uncover the truth. I received a message from Thomas the next morning, short, no greeting, just one line. "If you have time, I'd like to meet. Coffee on Tremont Street, noon." I hadn't expected to hear from Thomas again since the day he vanished from our dating app conversation. But there was something in the way he wrote an older, steadier rhythm that made me set everything else aside. I arrived 10 minutes early. That no longer surprised me. The cafe was wedged between 2 aging office buildings, its glass doors yellowed with time, its wooden chairs worn smooth at the edges. It wasn't the kind of place to impress. It was the kind of place for truth. Thomas arrived exactly on time. He wore a gray sweater, a heavy coat, and the look of a man who had worried enough in life that honesty no longer frightened him. After ordering coffee, he didn't bother with preamble. "Vincent isn't someone you should be near," he said. "I know what he does. I don't lie to myself about it. But I also know he has limits. The problem is, when someone crosses those limits, they never come back the same." I watched him without speaking. Thomas wasn't a man prone to drama. He seemed the balancing half of Vincent. If Vincent was the shadow, Thomas was the inside of the flame. But his voice today carried no neutrality. "I've seen the people who've worked with Vincent," he continued. "Some of them made it, some disappeared. Some, like me, stay halfway in and halfway out, because inside is too dangerous and outside is too honest to survive." My hand brushed the side of my coffee cup. Still hot, Thomas didn't stop. "He never forces anyone," he said, "but he creates situations where the only choice is to move forward. You may think you're steering the story, keeping your journalistic integrity, setting your boundaries, but one day you'll realize that every word you write, every meeting you take, every person you trust, it's all been inside his control from the start. I can stop, I said, though even my own voice sounded uncertain. No one stops once they've stepped in, Thomas replied. Not because Vincent forbids it, but because once you've seen how he moves things, how an entire city can shift with a few phone calls, you can't go back to being a reporter who types in a newsroom. You'll start to notice the gaps in the news, the stories your paper won't print. And the worst part is, you'll understand why people stay silent. I sat there, letting his words sink into the quiet rhythm of my pulse. Then Thomas pulled a small folded paper from his coat and slid it toward me. This is the name of a man who used to be a journalist. He isn't anymore. You can talk to him. Ask him why. I picked it up. Only a name and an email address. Nothing else. Thomas rose slowly, as though setting down a burden no one had asked him to carry. Before leaving, he paused beside the table. Vincent isn't evil, he said softly. He just doesn't believe in a world that exists outside his own rules. And when he lets someone into that world, the only thing he ever asks in return is absolute loyalty. I looked up at him. He hasn't asked that of me. Thomas gave a slight nod. Not yet, but he will. When he left the cafe, I remained seated, the scrap of paper still in my hand with the name of a man I'd never met. Outside, traffic drifted past like a current with no end. I wondered where I was in that flow, standing on the shore, taking notes, or already in the water, learning how to swim just to keep from being swept away. And I found myself asking, if a man like Vincent truly chooses someone to trust, is that a curse or a rare kind of faith, something so precious it's worth the cost? I saw Vincent again on a Thursday afternoon, just as rain began to fall softly over the stone steps of Beacon Hill. There had been no message, no arranged meeting, only a small slip of paper tucked between the documents I'd received from a nameless courier. In dark blue ink, a single handwritten line, rooftop, Ames Hotel, 6 o'clock. I knew I could refuse. I also knew I wouldn't. When I stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor, the cold wind slipped through my coat like a reminder that I was entering different air, thinner, sharper. Vincent stood at the far end of the terrace, hands in the pockets of his overcoat, eyes fixed on the rooftops darkening beneath the gentle rain. There was no drink, no secretary, no bodyguard, just a man standing alone above a city that somehow already belonged to him. I thought you wouldn't come, he said, without turning. So did I replied, moving to stand beside him. Thomas met with you, Vincent said, his voice calm, without reproach. He thinks I'm dangerous. He thinks you're gravity, I corrected, the kind that makes people leave pieces of themselves behind when they try to walk away. Vincent gave a brief smile but didn't argue. He handed me a small, thin envelope lighter than the last one. 3 names, 3 companies, same registered address, same legal representative. If you can trace their link to the South End transactions, you'll have a story no one dares to print. It was not too small. I held the envelope, but my eyes paused on his sleeve, where a loose stitch hinted that he'd worn this coat too many times, perhaps to shield something he'd never spoken of. Do you ever ask yourself why you're helping me? I asked not from suspicion, but from a need to understand. Vincent turned to face me. His eyes held no guard, no seduction. You're the only person I've met in 10 years who never asked who I am, only what I'm doing. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that if I did, I'd have to admit something to myself. I had already crossed a line. I no longer saw Vincent as merely a source. He was the man who had read every article I'd ever written, remembered each detail about the redevelopment zones, understood how I formed my questions before I even voiced them. And in a world where truth was always bartered, there was someone standing before me who asked for nothing in return. That was why it was suddenly hard to breathe, not out of fear, but because I realized I was feeling something dangerously close to trust. Vincent looked straight into my eyes when he said, "You can walk away any time, Elaine. I won't stop you." But what he didn't say was that if I chose to stay, there would be no path out that didn't leave a trace. I nodded, not a promise, not an answer, just the kind of nod that 2 adults understand means nothing will be simple from this point on. On my way home, I opened the envelope and saw 3 names. None were familiar, yet immediately I recognized the pattern behind them. They were the visible edges of a web already forming in my mind, threads beginning to intersect, tangling reason with intuition, trust with emotion. I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long while, the wind trembling against the windshield, and I realized something had shifted. This was no longer a straightforward investigation. It had become a connection, not between a journalist and her source, but between two people trying to understand each other through the fragments of a secretive city. I didn't know what waited beyond this story, but I knew that from that moment forward, every piece of information I received would carry something heavier emotion. And the most dangerous moment of all is when emotion seeps into truth, when the line between ethics and belief fades faster than either of us can recognize. I spent the entire afternoon in my small, silent apartment, spreading documents across the table and floor like an old wound finally torn open after years of being hidden. The 3 names in Vincent's envelope, taken separately, meant nothing, but once I began linking them by office addresses, founding dates, legal representatives, and the flow of money in the bank records I'd already collected, a pattern emerged, so clear it felt almost brutal. Each company was a transfer station. Cash from convenience stores and restaurants with abnormally high transactions was gathered, redistributed through shell corporations, and then funneled into offshore investment funds disguised as legitimate. Everything cycled clean, seamless, and returned through real estate contracts polished to the last period. Had I not possessed Vincent's copies of the documents, I might have doubted my own eyes. But what unsettled me was how deliberate the data felt. It wasn't a careless leak. It was too precise, too thorough, as if someone inside Marzano's network had been documenting every move, every transaction, every deviation, waiting for the right moment to let it slip into the light, or to use it as leverage. By 10 o'clock that night, I couldn't sit still any longer. The air inside my apartment felt too dense, the silence too loud. I needed the city's pulse to test whether I was still grounded in reality. I walked into a convenience store at the end of Hancock Street, one of the locations listed in the acquisition chain. The man behind the counter looked at me with empty eyes. The place was quiet, unremarkable, like hundreds I'd been in before. But something in the atmosphere was taut, as if the room itself was waiting. I bought a bottle of water, pretending to ask about the broken ATM in the corner, just to give myself an excuse to look around. The security camera on the wall was angled slightly off, not toward the customers, but toward whoever entered. On the counter, the order ledger was blank for the last 3 days. I thanked the clerk and stepped out, but instead of heading home, I crossed the street and took cover behind a lamppost, watching through the glass. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. Then, at the 6th, a black SUV pulled up quietly to the rear door. 2 men stepped in through the side entrance, carrying large canvas bags. Neither looked around, neither hurried. One of them nodded to the clerk, a gesture so casual it could only come from routine. I had no camera, and pulling out my phone would have drawn attention, so I just stood there, in the shadows, my heart racing absurdly for something so ordinary and yet unmistakably wrong. They left after 10 minutes. The SUV rolled north without signaling, without revving the engine, sliding away like smoke. When I returned to my car, I knew I was no longer just observing. I had been seen. The vehicle parked 3 meters away didn't move, but I felt the weight of its gaze settle on me like a hand on my shoulder. I quickened my pace, unlocked my door, and in that brief instant before starting the engine, I saw his reflection in the rearview mirror. Not a stranger. The same man who'd stood behind Vincent in an old photo I'd found while tracing the Marzano network. I didn't know his name, but I knew his eyes. The eyes of someone waiting for orders. I drove off, not speeding, but not calm enough to turn on the radio like I usually did. Tonight, the city wasn't a backdrop anymore. It had become a stage, and I was no longer the reporter watching from the wings. I had been pulled into the scene. When I finally stopped the car in front of my building, my palms were still damp with sweat, and I knew, with a certainty that cut through exhaustion, that tonight was only the beginning. Everything Vincent had given me wasn't just information. It was a map. And I had just stepped into a territory no one ever leaves without leaving a trace. I didn't tell anyone about being followed that night. I didn't call the police, didn't tell the newsroom, and didn't text Vincent. Part of me wanted to believe it was merely a warning, a quiet presence meant to remind me I had gone too far. But another part knew that silence never meant safety. 3 days later, I received a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no introduction, just one line. If you're smart, you'll stop digging into the Hancock Street store. I stared at the screen, feeling as if someone had kicked me hard in the gut. The text wasn't long, Not explicitly threatening, but it knew exactly what I was doing and where. I had never told anyone about that store. I hadn't logged it into the newsroom system, hadn't shared a note, hadn't sent a single photo, which meant I'd been watched far longer than I'd realized. That night, I decided to stay home. My apartment had one entrance, 2 windows, and a fire escape leading to the alley behind. I drew the curtains, locked the door, turned off every light. In the darkness, I sat at my desk, the laptop glowing faintly, unable to type a single word. Something larger than me was in motion, a network that didn't just launder money, but controlled information, tracked movements, and now hovered close enough to feel my breath. Near midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Then a knock, soft, deliberate, not hurried. As if the person behind the door knew I was there, listening, and was waiting. I didn't move. The knock came again, a second time, then a third, then silence. 10 minutes later, I heard the hum of an engine in the alley below. I rushed to the window just in time to see the red taillights of a small car disappearing into the dark. The next morning, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph, taken from a distance. Me standing in front of the Hancock convenience store, my head slightly tilted, as if listening to someone speak. The picture was printed on glossy paper, unmarked, unsigned. I placed it on the table, my heart thudding heavily. There was no doubt anymore. I had been marked. I don't know why I called Vincent then. Maybe because there was no one else to call. Maybe because, quietly, I'd begun to think of him as a kind of shield even if I wasn't sure that was true. He answered after a few rings. His voice didn't sound surprised, only lower than usual. I said just 2 words. They're watching me. No sound of papers shifting. No sharp inhale on the other end. Just his calm reply. I'm coming. 40 minutes later, Vincent was at my door. No guards, no escort car, just him, wearing a dark coat, empty-handed. When he stepped inside, he didn't look around like a stranger. He didn't ask if I was all right. He simply placed his phone on the table, opened a secure app, and began scanning the room for signals moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. After a moment, he found it a tiny recording device, no bigger than a fingertip, hidden behind the bookshelf. My face burned as I stared at it. I didn't know how long it had been there, who had planted it, or when my private thoughts had stopped belonging to me. Vincent removed the bug gently, set it on the table, and finally turned toward me. This won't stop, he said, but you're not alone. I don't know how much I can trust you, I said, my voice hoarse from sleeplessness. Vincent didn't flinch. He just said, softly, I don't need you to trust me. I need you to be safe. It was the first time he had intervened directly, not with money, not with power, but with presence. By stepping into my personal space without asking, yet somehow without violating it. Just being there quietly, precisely, at the right moment. And that was enough for me to know that, even as reason tried to resist, my heart had already begun to tilt toward him, and perhaps the most frightening part wasn't being watched. It was realizing I no longer knew if I wanted to step back from the world Vincent represented. We left Boston early the next morning, before the sky had fully woken. Vincent didn't offer much explanation, only said he needed to get me out of the city for a while. I didn't ask why, and I didn't resist. The memory of the previous night was still raw in me, like a cut that hadn't healed, and if temporary distance could bring any clarity, I was willing to try. We drove for 3 hours straight, past rows of faded red brick houses, through leafless winter woods, and silent towns that seemed to be sleeping through the season. When Vincent turned the car onto a gravel road winding up a gentle hill, I saw it a stone villa standing among sparse pines, with sloping roofs, wooden doors, wide windows, and a stillness so complete it made me uneasy. Not out of fear, but because that controlled beauty made me feel like an outsider. Vincent stopped the car at the front porch, stepped out, and without a word, opened my door. He led me inside. The house smelled faintly of polished pine. Everything was immaculate, almost emotionless. The walls were lined with old oil paintings, the floor dark hardwood, and the fireplace glowed faintly as if someone had lit it in anticipation of our arrival. The air wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It held a kind of balance too deliberate to be natural. This place is safe, Vincent said simply. No one knows about it but me and one other person. You can stay as long as you need. I nodded, my eyes roaming the space around us. I didn't know what to call it, a refuge, a retreat, or a prison wrapped in silk. Whatever it was, my first feeling wasn't relief. It was being contained. That afternoon, I walked the grounds. Behind the villa, a narrow path led to a lake, its surface partly frozen, catching the thin light of the winter sun. There wasn't another house in sight. I realized this place wasn't just remote, it was removed, as if every sound from the outside world had been caught in the trees and left behind. When I came back in, Vincent was in the upstairs library, reading. He looked up for only a second before lowering his gaze again, as if my presence didn't disturb the space he occupied. I stepped closer, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Have you ever brought anyone here before?" Vincent closed the book, his eyes not surprised, only darker. "Once, a long time ago. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. Some stories once spoken turn into confessions, and I wasn't sure Vincent was ready to confess anything." Night fell sooner than I expected. In the wide, orderly kitchen, we ate dinner together. We didn't talk much, only the quiet clink of silverware and the sound of wind scratching at the window panes like invisible fingers. Vincent cooked. He sliced the meat evenly, seasoned it with precision, grilled it at just the right heat, nothing excessive, nothing wasted. Every movement was disciplined, as if precision were the only form of control he had left in a chaotic life. After dinner, he washed the dishes while I watched him from behind, wondering if this was truly the man an entire criminal network feared, or just someone who had lived in the dark so long he'd forgotten what real light looked like. Before bed, I stepped out onto the balcony. The hotel room where I'd written my first article had never known a moment of silence like this. I could hear the wind passing through the trees, the faint shiver of the roof tiles, and my own heartbeat, uneven and loud in the stillness. I thought of Boston, the unfinished files, the man who had watched me outside the convenience store, and of Vincent, the man who asked nothing of me, yet somehow made me want to give more than I'd ever allowed myself to give before. This villa was a gilded cage, no locks, no guards, but filled with the most dangerous kind of captivity, the feeling of being cared for. And I was beginning to understand that the greatest danger didn't come from threats outside, but from the quiet desire to trust, to feel safe, and to stay longer than I ever meant to. We stayed at the Vermont villa longer than I expected. At first, it was supposed to be 2 days, just enough time for things to settle. Then 3. By the 5th day, I had stopped asking Vincent when we would return to Boston. Not because I'd forgotten my work, but because everything here seemed detached from the restless pulse of the world outside. Time slowed. There were no city sounds, no calls from the newsroom, no reminder emails about deadlines. Only the forest, the wind, and the quiet repetition of meals, the heartbeat of a house that seemed to live off memory. Each morning, I woke while the sun was still low. Vincent was always there, in the kitchen, brewing black coffee for both of us. He never asked if I'd slept well. I never told him about the fragmented dreams I wasn't sure I should analyze. We ate breakfast in silence, not the kind that strained, but the kind that felt like something was being protected. Maybe a boundary, maybe a wound still healing. By lunchtime, he cooked. I set the table. Neither of us said what we were doing. Every movement was instinctive, guided by memory and rhythm, as if we had known each other far longer than a month. And within that sudden familiarity, I began to notice myself changing. Not by looking at Vincent more, but by watching who I was when I was near him. I no longer saw myself as a journalist. I no longer saw him as a subject. I was simply living in the spaces between words and realizing those spaces had become too precious to dissect with reason. Once, while preparing dinner, Vincent reached for the wrong kind of salt, the one I usually used. I almost corrected him, but didn't. I simply handed him the right jar. When he looked at me, it wasn't gratitude I saw, but the quiet care of someone trying to preserve something fragile between us, something that would vanish if either of us dared to name it. That night, after dinner, I walked alone toward the lake. The surface was half frozen, the moonlight turning it into a fractured mirror. I sat on a stone bench, pulling my coat tighter, trying to name the feeling that had been growing inside me. It wasn't love, not quite trust either. It was a kind of pull, a silent gravity of presence, like touching an old scar that no longer hurts, yet you can't stop tracing it. I didn't know if Vincent felt it too. He never touched me, never said anything that crossed the line between protector and guest, but his eyes, when I poured coffee, when I folded the blanket in the morning, when I tied my hair before dinner, carried something that made me want to step closer, then step back again. afraid that if I broke the stillness, I'd lose it forever, and maybe he was holding on to something just the same. Once, when I asked about returning to the city, he simply said, "Not yet." I didn't ask why. There was something in his tone that told me he was keeping me here not just for safety but because my presence softened a part of him he couldn't name. We ate dinner beneath the warm light of the kitchen lamp. No music, no television, only the faint clink of silverware, and sometimes the sound of breathing as if we were sharing a secret neither dared to voice. Each meal felt like a quiet ritual, two people who had lived by logic now learning how to live through silence. And in a house without locks, without cameras, without codes, I found myself held tighter than anywhere I'd ever been. Not by promises, but by the silence between the moments we looked at each other too long, and neither of us turned away first. That night, snow fell thinly, a white dust settling over the stone steps outside the villa. I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but because something inside me was shifting, quietly, like an underground current changing its course. When I went downstairs for water, I found Vincent sitting alone by the window, the dim light from a desk lamp reflecting off his hands as he held a small silver ring. He didn't look surprised to see me, only tilted his head slightly, motioning for me to come closer. I sat across from him, and for the first time, I saw his eyes without their usual restraint or reason. They were darker, tired, distant, as if he had just returned from a very cold place in his memory and hadn't fully found his way back. He placed the ring on the table between us. A simple band. No stone, no engraving. Her name was Lydia, Vincent said, his voice low, each word released as though it had been lodged in his throat for years. We met when I was no one. Just a kid from Brooklyn, trying to make something of a life built on cheap meals and nights in basements. Lydia was light, not because she saved me, but because she never asked me to be anyone but myself. I didn't interrupt. I only watched him, Vincent went on, like a man who had been waiting long enough to speak without asking for forgiveness. I promised her I'd never get involved in what I'm in now. I really believed I could stay clean. But then my father died. No explanation, no paperwork, no investigation, just a phone call telling me where to find the body. I dug, and when I found the truth, I knew that if I didn't step in, I'd never be able to protect anyone I loved. He lowered his head, clasping his hands together as if holding back something that wanted to break free from the past. I started taking over his network, organizing, cleaning it up, keeping things quiet and controlled. I thought that as long as I kept everything neat, silent, under wraps, I could live two lives. By day, Lydia's husband. By night, the man this city whispers about. But darkness doesn't share. It consumes. I heard the wind whistle through the cracks in the door, but it wasn't as cold as his voice when he spoke next. She died in a car crash. They said it was the weather, but I knew better. Nothing's ever an accident when, a few weeks before, I'd refused to sign a land transfer in the south end of the city. It was the same area where Lydia wanted to build a community center for kids to have books, a place to play, somewhere that wasn't swallowed by the dark. I looked at the ring on the table. The silver had tarnished, its edges worn smooth like it had been worn too long, and taken off too late. Vincent fell silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice belonged only to the night and to the part of me that quietly cracked open with it. I didn't hold a big funeral. No press, no announcements. Just a small service. Only me and Thomas. She hated noise, hated pity. I kept my promise. I didn't realize I had left my chair until I was standing beside him, placing my hand gently on his shoulder. I felt the body that had always seemed strong and unshakable now still, defenseless, unguarded. Vincent, I said his name for the first time, not as a word, but as an understanding. He looked up at me. No tears. Just a man allowing himself to be fragile for a single moment, before sealing it away again. I couldn't protect her, he said softly. But I swore I'd never let it happen again. In that moment, I understood why I was here. Not just to investigate. Not because Vincent was a mystery to unravel, but because within the layers of memory and shadow he carried, I had glimpsed something few ever would, the heart of a man everyone believed had none left to break. And it was then I knew. Leaving would no longer be easy. 2 days after the night Vincent told me about Lydia, we left Vermont. No one said exactly why, but I sensed the change the moment morning broke. Vincent was quieter than usual. He woke early, spent nearly an hour on the phone in his study, and then silently began packing. I didn't ask. I knew how darkness spreads, it doesn't announce itself. doesn't knock. But when a man like Vincent moves, something has already happened. When the car merged onto the highway heading south, Vincent kept his eyes on the road and said, flat, without emotion, without giving me time to react, "They know who you are." The words were light, like he was reminding me to fasten my seatbelt, but I could hear the chill of metal in them. I asked who they were, though I already knew. Vincent answered with one name, Marzano. They had stayed quiet for too long. And the moment I traced the Hancock Street stores and the 3 shell companies, I became a threat. Vincent said that network wasn't just about laundering money, it was the bloodstream feeding the city's hidden power. Touch one vein, and you got pulled all the way down. By the time we reached Boston, everything had changed. My inbox was wiped clean. My personal email locked for unauthorized access. My phone rang again and again, from unknown numbers, no words, only steady breathing, and a silence so intimate it felt like someone was counting my heartbeat. When I returned to my old apartment, the lock had been replaced. Vincent took me to another one, a unit inside a building he owned through someone else's name. The apartment was small but spotless, and more importantly, untraceable to me. From now on, no credit cards, don't call from your old number. Don't log into anything, Vincent said, handing me a new phone. Elaine Harper no longer exists. She's just a name they're hunting. I looked at him, part of me wanting to scream, to demand why we weren't fighting back. But I knew Vincent wasn't a man who ran. This wasn't retreat, it was strategy. He wasn't afraid of being seen. He just refused to let me get hurt. When I turned on the TV, the afternoon news mentioned a financial leak involving 3 local businesses. No names were given, but the footage showed the same storefronts I'd investigated. Marzano was already cleaning house. They knew who I was. They were erasing everything, and if I was part of the chain, then I was one more loose end to remove. That night, I dreamed I was running down a long corridor with no windows, no exit, only the echo of footsteps behind me growing closer and closer. I woke in the dark, sweat soaking through my shirt, and saw Vincent sitting beside the bed. He wasn't asleep. Maybe he never slept when danger was near. "I used to think I was tough enough not to be afraid," I whispered, "but I've never been hunted for doing the right thing." Vincent didn't answer. He just reached over and placed the new phone in my hand. "Tomorrow, Thomas will come. He has his own line, a way to send your story out. Not through the paper, not through the big outlets, but enough to make noise." I nodded, not because I wanted to win, but because I finally understood that silence was exactly what they wanted from me, and I would not give it to them. After Vincent left the room, I sat alone in the dark. There was no Elaine Harper anymore. I had become someone else, someone who could no longer live quietly without feeling guilty, and it was only when they began to hunt me that I realized what I had truly touched. Not power, not Vincent. The truth, and even if that truth erased me from the map, I would not turn back. Thomas arrived the next morning, right on time as always, his worn gray coat draped over one arm, his face showing nothing but absolute focus. He didn't bother with greetings, just looked at me and nodded slightly, as if every word we needed had already been spoken somewhere between us. We sat across from each other in the living room of the safe apartment Vincent had arranged. The dim light through the window cast long shadows across the papers on the table, making them look like the map of a battlefield. I handed Thomas the latest copies of the data, everything I had compiled from the shell companies Vincent exposed, along with the analysis I'd written over 2 sleepless nights. Thomas read in complete silence. His eyes moved quickly, methodically, with the precision of a man trained to process danger as data. When he finally looked up, something in his expression had changed. "This is bigger than I thought," he said slowly. "You're not just brushing up against a money laundering network. You're cutting into a bloodstream that keeps more than one system alive." I nodded, though part of me still wondered if I was truly ready for what would follow. Thomas tucked the files into the inside pocket of his coat and stood. "I've got someone outside who'll move this through a secure line. If we're lucky, in 2 days it'll be published through an independent outlet." He warned me to stay cautious, then left. I watched from the window until he disappeared around the corner. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd see him walk away unaided. That evening, I stepped out of the apartment for only a few minutes to buy coffee from the stand across the street. When I came back, the door was ajar, the kind of small, wrong detail that freezes the air in your lungs. I pushed it open slowly. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out my own footsteps. Nothing looked disturbed, but the desk lamp was off. I knew I'd left it on. I barely had time to turn toward the door when a shadow lunged from the hallway. Everything happened fast. I fell hard, my head striking the edge of the chair, the flash of pain turning the world white. When my vision cleared, Thomas was on the floor, wrestling a masked man in black. The sound of the struggle filled the room like thunder, then a groan. The intruder broke free and ran. The door slammed behind him. I pushed myself up, blood dripping down my face. Thomas lay on his side, his hand pressed to his stomach, the dark wool of his sweater already soaked through. "Thomas," I called, my voice trembling so badly it barely formed words. He gave a crooked smile. "Just a scratch, deeper than I'd like." "I do exist." I lifted his head onto a pillow, pressing my hands against the wound the way I'd once read in an emergency manual. The blood was hot and stubborn, refusing to stop. Vincent arrived less than 10 minutes after I called. He didn't ask a single question. He just lifted Thomas as if he weighed nothing and motioned for me to follow. We didn't go to a hospital. Vincent had his own doctor, his own sterile room hidden deep inside a converted warehouse in the industrial district. When Thomas was stabilized and sedated, I stood outside the door, my hands still stained with his blood, my throat raw and dry. Vincent stood beside me, his face shadowed. "I didn't think they'd move this fast," he said quietly. I didn't answer. Inside me was a tangle of anger, guilt, and a grief so sharp it barely let me breathe. If I hadn't left the apartment, if I had locked the door, if I hadn't let Thomas come for the files, if I hadn't written any of this, the words looped in my head like a broken metronome. When I looked at Vincent, I saw something I'd never seen before, not calculation, not fury, but worry, not only for me, but for Thomas. Despite the lives they'd chosen, despite the world that had split them apart, they were still brothers, and because of me, someone caught between those two worlds, Thomas had bled. I sat down on the cold step outside the corridor, covering my face with both hands. I didn't cry, but my eyes burned until I could barely open them. I had chosen this path, but I hadn't imagined the cost would be pain inflicted on the one person who'd warned me from the start that if I stepped too close to Vincent, I'd stop being myself. Now I understood. Losing yourself isn't just about changing, it's about losing what you never meant to hurt. And the first thing I'd lost was the peace of those who never asked to pay my price. 3 days after Thomas was injured, I got a call from the editor-in-chief. His voice was colder than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the familiar warmth that had once belonged to a man who'd mentored me for nearly a decade. There were no pleasantries, no inquiries about how I was holding up. He went straight to the point. The board had met, and they had decided to terminate my contract effective immediately. No explanation, no right to appeal, no additional words. By the time I hung up, my internal email had already been frozen, my files transferred to legal, and my name removed from the paper's investigative roster. 10 years of work, 10 years of chasing truth, 10 years of holding journalistic integrity as something sacred, erased by a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. I sat there after the call ended, not shocked the way I'd imagined, but hollow, as if someone had quietly drained the air from the room, leaving me to breathe in nothing. Vincent knew the moment I walked back into the apartment, my eyes emptied of their usual edge. He didn't ask what happened. He just poured a glass of water, set it on the table, and waited. I told him everything in a few sentences. He nodded, unsurprised. "They've been warned," he said calmly. "If they keep you, they'll be next in line." I let out a dry laugh. So that's the line between truth and survival, thinner than I thought. Vincent didn't argue. He'd lived that choice before between speaking out and staying alive. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting by the window, watching the slow crawl of traffic below. A part of me wanted to disappear, to let go of all of it. But another part, the same part that had led me here, still burned for what was right, even if I had to stand alone. That night, I opened my manuscript again and made the final edits. I no longer had a newsroom, no editorial backing, so I registered a domain name myself, built a simple site, and gave it a modest title, The Quiet Ledger. The meaning was obvious to me, a silent ledger where everything hidden would finally be written down, line by line, fact by fact, truth by truth. Vincent helped me set up the security systems. He didn't interfere with the content or ask to read it. He only made sure no one could trace where I was. "If you're going to stand in the open," he said, "at least stand where they can't see you clearly." For the next 2 days, I worked almost without sleep. I wrote with everything. I had no editors, no policies, no need to protect the untouchables. I laid it all out. Marzano, the laundering network, the shell corporations disguised as legitimate businesses, the legal shields built by the same people sworn to uphold the law. I didn't use sensational words. I didn't dramatize. I simply told the truth, exactly as it was, and left the reader to feel what had been rotting beneath the surface of the city they called home. The article went live at 2 a.m. I expected nothing, just hoped someone would read it, someone brave enough to share. By sunrise, it had been shared over 500 times, mostly by independent journalists, former reporters, people who knew too well what it felt like to be silenced. An hour later, an anonymous comment appeared left by a retired state judge. It read, "Much of what's written here is very close to the truth we've chosen to forget." Vincent skimmed the article in silence. When I asked what he thought, he said only, "You've lit the fuse. Now let's see who tries to put it out first." I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I had lost my job, my title, and maybe more before this was over. But I'd gained something not everyone dares to keep, a voice. And even if it was small, solitary, it echoed in the dark just enough to make those who'd grown comfortable in silence finally look over their shoulder. I began to feel suffocated by the very safety Vincent had built around me. The apartment was encrypted, every electronic device monitored, every call filtered through a security system known only to him and Thomas. I lived behind layers of soundproof walls and reinforced doors, protected completely from the outside world, yet separated entirely from myself. At first, I accepted it as a necessary price for survival, for the chance to keep writing, to avoid disappearing like those who had tried to expose the truth and were buried in silence instead. But by the second week, I stopped sleeping. I couldn't leave the apartment without someone trailing me. I couldn't open my computer without going through the private network Vincent had created. I couldn't send an email without seeing his name in the corner of the screen. A quiet reminder that I was being watched, even if the watching came in the name of protection. One night, without warning, I knocked on his door. Vincent was standing by his desk, the lamplight spilling over a map of the city, marked with dozens of small red dots. When he looked up, he didn't seem surprised, just slightly tilted his head, waiting for me to speak. "We need to talk," I said, trying to steady my voice, though my throat felt dry as paper. Vincent nodded and gestured toward the chair opposite him. There was no music, no wasted light. Everything in his room was neat, precise, and so unnervingly quiet that I felt like a misplaced sound. "I need to know," I began slowly, "if everything you're doing is to protect me or to control me." "To res." He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on me, not angry, but not soft either. It was the look of someone who'd thought about this question before, but had never heard it spoken aloud. "You think I'm controlling you?" he asked finally, his voice low, deliberate. I nodded. "You know every move I make, every line I write, every place I draw a question mark. You don't tell me what to do, but you're always there like a boundary." "What?" Vincent exhaled, not a weary sigh, but a slow breath, as if to keep himself from reacting too quickly. "Elaine," he said, using my full name for the first time in days. "You're not like the others. You run toward danger, not because you want attention, but because you can't stand injustice. I know that, but you forget that courage doesn't exempt you from consequence." I clenched my hands on my knees, lifted my head, and met his eyes. "And protection doesn't exempt you from being questioned," I said. "I'm not a hostage, Vincent. I'm not a name you have to hide so the world can't reach me." He sat still, fingers interlaced, gaze unwavering. "I lost Lydia because I didn't control enough," he said quietly. "Because I believed love could protect itself from the world. I was wrong. I won't make that mistake again." The words hit something deep inside me. In that moment, I saw what he'd been hiding behind all his calm, not power, not calculation, but fear. The fear of losing one more person he couldn't save. I stepped closer, until I stood right in front of him, looking into those dark, unguarded eyes. "I'm not Lydia," I whispered. "And I don't need a cage, even if it's made of gold. If you really want to protect me, let me breathe. Let me walk on my own. Let me fail if I have to and fall, if that's what comes with choosing for myself." "It's traded." Vincent said nothing, but his shoulders eased, just slightly, as if my words had touched a place he didn't know was still alive. He stood, walked slowly to the window, and looked out. The city lay beneath us, blanketed in darkness, the lights flickering like breath. "Tomorrow," he said, You can go out on your own. There will be someone following you from a distance. No interference, no instructions. I nodded. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was a start. And maybe that was all either of us needed to learn how to love someone without holding them hostage to fear, but with trust. Even if trust was the hardest thing to keep alive in a world like ours. 4 days after my confrontation with Vincent, I received a strange parcel. No sender's name. Just a plain brown envelope, the address typed neatly, no smudges, no typos, no human trace. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw it. Only a handful of people knew where I was. Vincent had no reason to use the postal service when he could hand me anything directly. Thomas was still in the hospital, and I had no friends left in this city who would bother to write. I opened the envelope with a small knife, cautiously, as if dismantling a fragment of the past that might detonate at any second. Inside were 2 typed pages. No signature, no header, no logo. But the content was chillingly clear. They knew I was investigating Marzano. They knew I had information about Vincent Morelli. And they knew I was living under the protection of the man they called the final link in the chain of shadowed power. I read each line slowly, every word like a shard of ice dissolving on my tongue. The letter didn't threaten me. It didn't plead. It was, instead, an offer. They could give me access to classified files, unreleased evidence connecting Vincent to murder, money laundering, and political corruption. Every document, every name, every piece of proof would be delivered discreetly. No meetings, no witnesses, no trace. In exchange, I had to write. I had to go public. I had to bring Vincent into the light the way the justice system had failed to do for years. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table, staring out the window. The city beyond the glass was the same one I had once believed in orderly, lawful, a place where truth, if spoken loudly enough, would eventually be heard. Now I knew better. Truth didn't just need to be told. It needed to be placed in the right hands. And I wasn't sure mine still were. Down the hallway, Vincent had passed by 10 minutes earlier, coffee cup in hand, as quietly as always. The man who had saved my life in a dark corridor, the man who had helped me write when I thought I'd forgotten how, the same man who had once helped build the system I'd spent my life trying to expose. I didn't know how long I sat there before he returned and saw me with the letter in my hand. He froze for only a fraction of a second, then walked over and sat across from me. "It's them," I said. "The FBI. They want me to write. They want me to expose you." Vincent didn't react the way I expected. No anger, no denial, no surprise. Only a slight tilt of the head, as if weighing which truth to begin with. "They've always known how to pick their moment," he said quietly. "When you start questioning whether you're still on the right path, they show up holding a map." I searched his face for something, an admission, a refusal, any sign that would tell me whom to believe. But all I saw was a man who wasn't running from the truth. "What should I do?" I asked. "Should I sacrifice you for what I believe in?" Vincent was silent for a long time. Then, looking straight at me, he said, "If writing it makes the world fairer, I don't need to be forgiven. But if what you're holding becomes just another tool used by someone else to tilt the balance of power, then ask yourself who you're really writing for." His words hollowed the air between us. I couldn't breathe for a moment, because they forced me to turn the question inward. I had always believed I wrote for truth. But what good is truth if it's used the wrong way? I placed the letter in a drawer and locked it. I didn't destroy it. I didn't act on it. I just needed time. Not to choose between Vincent and my career, but to choose between real justice and the polished moral theater people build to disguise their own motives. And for the first time, I understood something I'd never grasped before. Sometimes the truth isn't in the answer. It's in the courage to hold on to the question long enough to let it break your heart. I spent the entire night alone in the small study, the lamplight casting its pale reflection across bare walls, as if it were illuminating the contradictions inside me. On the desk lay the file Vincent didn't know I had copied, resting beside the anonymous letter from the FBI. The typed words were like needles without voice, without inflection, but sharp enough to pierce through the layers of conviction I had built over a lifetime. I had written for truth, but this truth was no longer made of numbers and faceless corporations. It had a face, a heartbeat, an expression that once looked at me with such quiet gentleness that I'd stopped feeling like just a journalist. Vincent was no longer a character in a story. He was the man who cooked for me on snowy nights in Vermont, who draped his coat over my shoulders when I came home drenched, who sat beside me for 3 silent hours in a hospital hallway, while Thomas lay on an operating table. But he was also part of the system I had devoted my life to exposing, a man who had signed the papers, made the calls, stood behind the money that kept a city quietly decaying. I asked myself whether it was possible to love someone you might one day have to expose. I'd heard stories about journalists who compromised their ethics for personal ties, and I'd always promised I would never become one of them. I used to believe that integrity was unshakable, that the first time you made a deal with conscience, you stopped being yourself. But now I understood. Integrity isn't stone. It's a narrow bridge suspended between what's right and what's necessary. If I wrote, Vincent could be arrested, and if he were arrested, he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't name names. The true architects behind the network, the ones more powerful, faceless, untouchable, would remain intact. But if I didn't write, I would betray my own purpose. I would betray the unseen victims buried in falsified ledgers, betray the people who once believed my voice could carry their truth. Near dawn, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city below was still quiet, as if nothing terrible had ever happened there. Through the window, I saw Vincent in the kitchen, making coffee. The amber light from the stove washed across his face, and I wondered whether anyone had ever looked at the person they loved while weighing the cost of betrayal against the grace of forgiveness. When I came back inside, he didn't ask what I was thinking. He simply placed a cup of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. His eyes were calm, but not cold. I met his gaze and said, without evasion or disguise, I might write. I don't know if I'll use your name, but I can't stay silent forever. Vincent nodded. He didn't blame me. He wasn't angry. He said only one thing, something I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. If you write, he said, write everything. Not just what I've done, but why. Write about the choices no one wants to make but has to. About the systems larger than me. About the people behind the walls no one names. You don't owe me your silence. You owe yourself your honesty. In that moment, I realized he was giving me the most precious thing one subject can give a journalist. Not information, but permission to see them whole. Both good and flawed, both light and shadow. And I too granted myself the same permission. I didn't need to choose between truth and love. I only needed to write with everything I knew, everything I'd lived, seen, and felt. Without hiding, without idealizing, without turning anyone into a monster in the name of morality, or absolving them in the name of affection. I would write, and what I wrote would not be an indictment. It would be a portrait of a man, of a system, and of myself. A record of a collision I never expected to face, only to discover that perhaps there were never two opposing sides at all, just two faces of the same complicated truth. I published the story on a Monday morning. No announcement. No headline with Vincent's name, no sensational images or quotes designed to wound. I wrote it exactly as I had lived it, as I had seen and heard it, in both the darkness and light of a man the world only ever knew halfway. The piece neither defended nor condemned. It traced a journey from a system rotting at its core, through the choices of those who had long run out of exits, and ended with a question to the reader. What truly counts as justice when the law itself decides who deserves protection? I didn't wait for reactions. By the time it began spreading across independent circles and being cited by news outlets one after another, I already knew there was no going back to the life I had before. No more newsroom, no press badge, no desk by the window where I used to sip coffee before diving into another investigation. And strangely, I didn't feel loss. I felt lighter. Over the following days came nameless messages, dropped calls, and a few emails that said only one word, careful. I printed them, folded them, and tucked them into a drawer, a quiet reminder that truth is never welcomed in silence. Vincent never asked about the article, but on the third night after it was published, he came home with an old bottle of wine, set it on the table, and poured 2 glasses. We sat together in the living room without turning on the main light, letting the amber glow from the kitchen flicker across the rims. I thought you'd leave, he said after a long silence. When it was all over, when the story ran, when there was nothing left to keep you here. I swirled the wine gently, watching my reflection blur in the dark red surface. So did I said. I thought I'd go back to being a freelancer, writing stories no one cared enough to finish reading. But then I realized I can't keep investigating a world I no longer stand outside of. Vincent didn't look at me, but I knew he was listening the way he always did. Quietly, deeply, with the patience of someone who understands that silence is a form of respect. "I'm not the same Elaine Harper I was 6 months ago," I continued. "She lived by principles, by clear lines between black and white. But I know now that every truth carries the dust of the one who tells it. And I don't want to stand on the sidelines judging anymore." I set my glass down and turned fully toward him. "I'm staying. Not because I've forgiven everything you've done, but because I believe you're trying to rebuild in a way no one in your world ever dared to. And if I walk away now, everything I've written, everything I've chosen, will only ever be half the story." Vincent finally looked at me. No smile, no tenderness, just a man trying to conceal the gratitude he didn't know how to name. "Are you sure?" he asked. "My world is never safe. Even with love, it can still wound." I nodded. "I don't need safe. I need real." It was the first time we held each other not out of comfort, but out of recognition that neither of us stood outside the story anymore. I was no longer the witness. He was no longer the subject. We were two people caught in a journey that promised no happy ending, only an honesty we could live with. And that, to me, was enough. The next day, I moved out of the temporary apartment into a smaller space in the same building as Vincent's. My own keys, my own network, no surveillance. I began to write again. New stories that still carried the pulse of investigation, but with a shift in tone. I no longer wrote to expose. I wrote to connect, to open conversations instead of displaying wounds. And in those pages, I came to understand that the greatest silence I had ever broken wasn't the one belonging to a corrupt system, but the one I had imposed on myself, the limit of what I believed it meant to love someone. Not by denying the truth, but by choosing to live it together, in all its irreconcilable contradictions. Gabriel returned on an autumn morning, when the trees lining Huntington Avenue had begun to turn the color of old gold, and the air smelled faintly of something ending to make room for what was about to begin. He was in a wheelchair, thinner than the last time I saw him, yet his eyes were unchanged, the same steady gaze of someone who always stood outside the center yet understood every motion within it. Vincent was the one who met him at the airport. No bodyguards, no entourage, just two men, two fractured reflections of the same origin, who had once taken different paths, carried different sins, and now met again not as allies or adversaries, but as the last brothers left standing after a storm that had gone on too long. I stepped out into the courtyard. A scarf in hand, Vincent had told me to bring it. The weather was turning cold. When I came near, Gabriel looked up, studying me for a long moment before smiling. "Hello, Elaine," he said, his voice still warm, just as it had sounded that first time over the phone. "I thought we'd meet under different circumstances." I leaned down, wrapping the scarf gently around his neck, and smiled. "I thought if we ever met again, it'd probably be in an interrogation room." Gabriel laughed, then coughed softly, steadying himself. It was the first time I saw Vincent smile with something like genuine relief. We didn't live in the same apartment, but in the same building, 3 separate floors. Vincent occupied the top, where the sunlight touched the windows first each morning. I lived in the middle, where my desk faced the window, and the little kitchen held the coffee machine Vincent had given me last winter. Gabriel stayed on the ground floor, easier for the wheelchair, with a back door that opened into the garden where he spent most of his days in physical therapy. Our mornings found a rhythm of their own. I woke early, brewed coffee, and brought a cup down to Gabriel. Vincent usually appeared afterward, newspaper in hand, offering a short, dry comment about the latest political scandal. No one mentioned the past. It hovered in the air, thin as mist, soft enough not to obscure the shapes of what remained. I helped Gabriel follow his rehabilitation routine, small motions at first, then brief steps along the parallel bars. Sometimes he fell, scraping his hands, bruising his forehead, but he never complained. He would just smirk and say, "I've seen worse." I never asked what he meant. Some memories weigh enough without needing to be spoken. Vincent wasn't always there, but whenever he was, he would stand quietly by the doorway, watching Gabriel's progress, occasionally asking a simple question or nodding in approval. No one expected him to say more. One afternoon, as I wiped the sweat from Gabriel's forehead after a session, he caught my hand and squeezed it lightly. "Thank you for not leaving," he said. Neither of us was sure we deserved this. I tightened my grip, meeting his gaze, the gaze of a man who had lived too long in the dark, by choice and by circumstance. "No one ever fully deserves anything," I said, "but if we still have the chance, we can at least try to live as though we might." We had dinner together once a week. Sometimes Gabriel cooked simple meals, mostly. Sometimes I made Italian dishes from Lydia's old handwritten recipes that had survived the years. Vincent never cooked, but he always set the table and poured the wine exactly on time, as if that quiet role observer, protector, keeper of balance was the one he had chosen for himself in this fragile triangle. Though no one said it aloud, we all understood that what was forming between the three of us was not mere companionship. It was another kind of family bound, not by blood or obligation, but by scars recognizable only to those who had survived the same kind of loss. And in that silence, in every glass of wine poured, every careful step Gabriel took, every line I wrote late at night, we were learning how to live as a family. Not a perfect one, just a real one. The final dinner took place on a winter evening, when snow began to drift softly beyond the window panes, and Gabriel's small kitchen filled with the gentle scent of scallion butter from the baked salmon he had learned to make from an old video. There had been no prior announcement, no sense of farewell, only a quiet stillness spreading between the three of us seated around the familiar wooden table. Vincent, Gabriel, and I raised our glasses. No clinking, no polite words. Everything that needed to be said already rested within our eyes. Gabriel spoke first. He told us about a small house in Maine, where he planned to move that coming spring, a place without high walls or coated locks, only a wide porch and a white fence in need of paint. Vincent wasn't surprised. He simply nodded and asked if it was close to the ocean. Gabriel smiled, saying you could hear the waves after just a 10-minute walk. The conversation drifted, light as breath. No one mentioned the article, the FBI, or the network that had once been the axis of all our tension. No one revisited who had been right or wrong, who had forgiven, or who still carried regret. At some point, we all came to understand that certain things don't need confession. Some truths only need to be lived, not proven. When dinner ended, I rose to wash the dishes. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the backyard, while Vincent stepped onto the porch to light a cigar he rarely touched. I looked at them both and realized that this quiet moment was the true ending. Not an arrest, not a headline, not a letter from the court, just three people, once burdened by heavy pasts, now learning how to let go and to live again among small, ordinary, honest things. This story was never about a woman in love with a mafia boss. It was never a tragedy or a fairy tale. It was, at its heart, a lesson in choice, about how doing the right thing doesn't always come from moral certainty, but from the courage to look at another person with unguarded eyes, about how forgiveness doesn't always mean agreement, but the willingness to move forward without dragging the weight of yesterday behind you, and, most of all, about the truth that sometimes the only thing we can do for the people we love is not to hold them back, but to let them go when they finally find their way. Thank you for following me through this emotional and deeply human journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share this video to help its message reach more people. On the Our Channel YouTube channel, you'll find many more heartfelt, moving stories like this one, released every day. How did this story make you feel? Did you see a part of yourself in Elaine, in Vincent, or in Gabriel? Have you ever faced a choice that asked you to let go in order to stay true to yourself? Share your thoughts and your honest reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear your story and connect with you through it. Thank you for watching. I wish you good health, joy in your days, peace in your heart, and calm in your life. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video on our channel.